All right, everybody. Today we will be talking about Paul Auster's Invisible. I picked this book for a visual reason, which is in NP. There is the scene where the main character is at a party, and she meets two people, specifically a brother and sister, who go on to be a huge part of her life, and the three of them share a kind of bond through tragedy. And in Invisible, the book opens with Adam, who is our protagonist, meeting with Rudolph and Margot. And Rudolph and Margot are a couple at the time, and it's about how he sort of gets drawn in with them, and it sort of changes his life. So this sort of image, whenever there's been characters at a party that I've always been reminded of Invisible, of this specific meeting, and yet I've only read this book once. And rereading it again and getting to the ending, the final chapter has also stuck with me. I forgot which book it was from, but it stuck with me, the imagery of it, even if not the context. And that really sort of defines my relationship with Paul Auster as an author. I find him to be a writer who very much has good ideas, but his work either works best as shorter fiction, where he can just play with an idea and then get it out of the way, or it really needs more space. I've always felt like his work reads like something he gets bored with 2/3 of the way through and never can quite cap it off in the right way. But we'll save more of that for the pros and cons of this specific book. To get into the plot of the book, you have Adam, who is a 20-year-old college kid, an aspiring poet and writer, who falls in with Rudolph and Margot. Rudolph being a man about 10 years his senior, who is French, I believe, French-German, if I'm remembering it right. But he's a professor, and he's French-German, and he invites Adam to write a magazine for him, and even seems to all but force Margot upon him. And it's about how Adam sort of deals with this situation, and eventually eventually rather, he just ends up on a night out with Rudolph when something happens, and it's a burst of violence, and I don't want to say changes Adam's life forever, but it definitely becomes a big not halcyon Kairos moment for poor Adam. So that is the sort of setup. So to get into would I recommend this book, or who would I recommend it to, that's a little bit more difficult, because I already said, like, Paul Auster is very much a writer. I've read all of his works except for 432, all of his novels rather, except for 4321 and his most recent one, which he wrote before he died. And like I said, aside from the New York trilogy, where it was more idea-driven, I find Paul Auster to be a postmodernist writer in the sense that he embodies these sort of questions. Like, I'm going to talk about, like, one of the big themes of Invisible is memory and the reliability of memory, and that's important in the sense that it's a recurring theme in all of Auster's work. And Auster is very postmodern in the sense that he wants to challenge this sort of idea of perfect memory, this idea of narration being reliable, but he doesn't necessarily do it in a way that I feel he comes out on the other end having explicitly said something, which when you hear a lot of the criticisms of postmodernism, it's that postmodernism is very good at deconstructing things, but it's not very good at constructing things. And that's sort of Paul Auster as a whole, where I think that a lot of his work, when he deconstructs sort of reliability of narrator and reliability of memory, it's good at that, it's interesting at that, but it doesn't have anything to say about that beyond memory isn't necessarily reliable, things aren't always as they seem. At least, that's my takeaway. So in that sense, like, there's value to his work, and there's value to this story. I think it's, an enjoyable story. but it's not the kind of story where, particularly like Invisible in the wider context of Paul Auster's bibliography, with every other book I've reviewed sort of up until this point, I felt like if the book had been missing from the world, something would have been very much lost. Obviously nothing big, nothing earth-shattering, but I feel like these books sort of justify their own existence. And Invisible, while not necessarily... It's certainly not a bad book by any metric, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't have been made, but there's this sense to me that it doesn't do enough to really justify its own existence. Had Paul Auster never written this book, I don't think anybody would have been worse off for it, which is... It sounds incredibly harsh, but it just is what it is. It's not a matter of the book doing anything that I think is bad as much as it just doesn't do anything good. But in that sense, it kind of has some of those positive aspects that I really enjoy about Paul Auster's writing that mean that even though none of his books have really captured me and stuck with me, I nonetheless very much enjoyed my time rereading this book. And it's sort of frustrating that he doesn't go farther, that he doesn't do more with his ideas, because I think his writing, like his prose itself, is so good. So I'm kind of already getting into pros and cons. So just to wrap up who I would recommend it to, it's not the best Paul Auster. It's not the best place to start with Paul Auster. But if you're interested in Paul Auster and you think that this particular idea sounds compelling to you, then, go ahead and give it a try. It's not a long book, and it's not the worst book in the world. It's not going to hurt you to read it. That sounds like the most faint thing you could say. But in terms of Paul Auster's overall bibliography, I would put it at middle of the road. So ideally, like the best person to read this book is somebody who's already read some of Paul Auster's other more notable works, like the New York Trilogy, like Moon Palace, like Leviathan, and is looking for more of Paul Auster. So that's who I would recommend it to. To get into the pros and cons. Pros. I already kind of touched on it, but the sort of universal pro that I enjoy about Paul Auster is his writing. His prose very much captures the New York attitude that I actually kind of enjoy. There's a certain style of writing that is just New York in flavor, in description, in the sort of non-self-conscious attitude of it. And Paul Auster embodies that perfectly. So it's such an easy thing to read and go through, and it's got kind of that sort of bitter, almost noirish edge to the prose that really makes it sort of compelling without necessarily going full hard-boiled or cynical into the whole thing. So prose definitely a plus. It's a plus to any Paul Auster novel, I think. Specifically to Invisible, the way that the story is told, I think, is it's interesting in sort of the way that it reflects the criticisms of memory. So it's not really minor spoiler to say, or it's not really like a spoiler to say that the form of the book is that it's split up into 4 parts. And the first part is first person from Adam's perspective. The second part is second person from Adam writing to himself as a you. The third is third person, Adam writing his story as he. And then finally, the last one is not even from Adam's perspective at all. It's a diary from a young Frenchwoman that Adam met in part 3. And throughout this is the framing device of a writer who was one of Adam's former alumni, and the writer is receiving Adam's manuscript. Adam was ill and eventually, well, I won't get into spoilers there, but so there's this other voice into the story, which is you eventually find out the writer who is ostensibly crafting this manuscript. And I think that the way that plays with sort of the questions of authenticity that the book brings up is very poignant because you have, I mean, literally you go from first person to second person to third person to a completely different perspective. With each part, you're getting farther and farther away from Adam as a character, but also the truth of the situation gets more and more muddied as more and more things come up to sort of throw into question maybe, how reliable is Adam as a narrator, how reliable is the story. So in terms of the structure of the book and how it relates to that theme, it's very well done. In terms of the cons, it ties back to the same thing. Oh, sorry. To go back to a pro really quick. The pacing is excellent. It's a short book. It's a very quick read. It's brisk. I think I read most of the book just today. I read like the first 90 pages and then just finished it off today. So very easy, very breezy read. And for the most part, I think the characters are really likable, even in their complexities or necessarily less likable moments, let's say, with some of the stuff that goes on with Adam. But going on into the cons, it just, again, it doesn't quite come together in the way that I want. Like, it's not as bad as I would say some of Auster's other novels are. In fact, I would argue on the whole it might even be one of his best ones in terms of how it sort of leaves you feeling, at least it left me feeling somewhat satisfied. But still, I mean, I wanted more. I wanted to sort of, it ties back sort of thematically. So you've got this story level of wanting more from the characters and whatnot, but then on the sort of thematic level, you've also got this statement, like I said, of the book does a very good job of questioning that theme of memory, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's sort of that postmodern deconstruction, but there's never anything that you can take out of it. So in that sense, like, it's a book that you reach the end of it and you go, that was interesting. Wow, I guess that, you never really know who's right or wrong. And then that's kind of it. That's, you can't really do much more with it, at least not, from my perspective, because there are a few sub-themes, but they're kind of so sub and the characters are so sort of focused on playing their part that they don't feel quite like they have enough layers outside of that. So those are sort of my pros and cons. Well written, brisk pace, interesting structure, but doesn't quite wrap up in the most satisfying way thematically. And I just wish that there was a little bit more to it, but even that I'm kind of a bit on the fence about. So now I'm going to go into full spoilers and talk about the themes. So memory, the big theme is memory. I've already kind of touched on this with the 4 parts, but to really get into it, it's not just that with each part, you not only get farther away from Adam, you've got the first part, which is first person, as I've already said, then second, then third, then fourth. Well, fourth, I should say, just a different character entirely, being, physically in terms of our narrative proximity to Adam. With each part, we get farther away. But we also discover the hand of his friend Jim, or James, and how he has already altered the names and certain events in the story, so that even some of the stuff that we've read in the first part, we know now has been tampered with. It is not exactly Adam's words. It's not even Adam's name. Nobody's name is their name. So in that sense, you have not just the... Well, and then I guess I should mention, in the second part of the story, Adam describes an incestuous relationship with his sister that later on in the third part, his sister insists never happened. And the thing is, she insists that the rest of the story is true, but that further complicates why he lied about that particular aspect. And the story brings this up, but it never really goes anywhere with it. And this is where, again, I come back to, like, interesting ideas, but it feels like Auster kind of gets bored with them partway through of, okay, I understand that the idea is that we're not, it's highly possible that his sister is lying, that she's saying this just to cover up her own life, and the writer Jim James, Jim or James, even posits this possibility, but doesn't really make much of an effort to follow up on it, and even outright says that it doesn't matter to him one way or the other whether it's true or not. So it's just a thing that happens, and we're left to decide whether it's real or not, which unto itself, like, okay, it adds that level of ambiguity where you're meant to be questioning the veracity of what is being given to us via Adam, but it also feels like unto itself. I don't know enough about Gwyn at any point really, to understand why she might be lying. I don't understand her circumstances. I don't understand, other than like it's an uncomfortable thing and she says some stuff. Rather than a question of who to believe, who not to believe, narratives that we make and why we make those narratives, it basically just boils down to this question of, well, maybe you shouldn't trust Adam. Maybe everything he's written is a lie, although, it does suggest that other aspects tally up, so not everything is a lie, but what is true and what isn't, you can't really tell. But again, like, I want more questioning of why. So I've mentioned multiple times in the past how I enjoy surrealist works. I enjoy magical realist works which challenge our perception of reality. And I enjoy those works because they help, or because I enjoy that idea, I enjoy that concept, and I enjoy reading them to inform my understanding of perception and how perception becomes reality and how much objective reality is a construct that we make for ourselves, and that, in terms of human societal structures that define our lives, those are defined by perception more so than objective reality. So in terms of, there's a clear divide between sociological constructs and actual sort of the physics, the actual literal physics of the world that you could call objective. And a lot of what we interact with and engage with on a day-to-day and even larger ethical and moral basis are really matters of perception and subjectivity. So those are the things that I enjoy about surrealism and magical realism. So in that sense, I enjoy what Auster does with postmodernism in terms of challenging these ideas of what can you trust in a narrative and what can, the sort of challenging the objectivity of perception and of stories and of narrative. But where, again, like surrealism and magical realism, when done well, I should say, it not only calls into question these things, but it tends to offer some kind of solution to it, or can offer some kind of not just positivity, but again, like, it's one thing to break things down, but it's another to build things up. And I don't get that out of this story. It's good at challenging, like I said, it's good at challenging the idea that you can't rely necessarily on Adam's testament, but at the same time, it doesn't give you enough about Gwyn or any of the other characters to really understand why Adam might be lying, or why they might have a vested interest in portraying him as a liar. Apologies for the pause there. A insect flew in my face, and it is no more. So the question is, not really the question, but for me, like, okay, there are these themes of memory, but it doesn't go quite far enough. And the sort of sub-themes in the book, sort of America and its role in, Vietnam and the violence of Vietnam, and the question of Adam trying to be this good person but struggling with what it means to be a good person. They're kind of there, but either I don't know enough and there's some kind of a parable going on that I'm missing. But if there is, and this isn't like, I'm not trying to excuse my ignorance. If there is some kind of parable going on in this story and I'm just a dum-dum completely missing that, then I fully acknowledge that. This is not like an excuse for that ignorance so much as even a parable, I feel, has to stand on its own or be capable of conveying its message absentee understanding of the reference that it is making. And if there is a parable going on in Invisible that I am missing, then the story on its own does not convey enough in terms of, like I said, the role of America or nationalism or sort of the moral decline of Adam as a person, if you want to argue that there was a moral decline to begin with. I mean, certainly he observes the murder of this individual and feels like, well, it's almost confined to the first part, because in the first part, you have his thing about wanting to be sort of more pacifist, more anti-Vietnam, anti-government, anti-conservative sort of ideologies. But then when confronted with this violent act and given the choice to call the police or let things slide for his own safety, he hesitates, and this gives Bourne, or Rudolph, the chance to escape. And he feels that in his hesitation, he has violated this sort of oath to be a good person, which you find out about that oath in the second part of the story, that he has sort of upheld, or, you know, he views himself as sort of a humanist, and in allowing this act of violence to go unpunished, he feels like he has violated that term. But and that's sort of what haunts him. But whether that ties into sort of the acts of incest that go on in the second book, or that maybe don't go on because we don't know, is questionable. I don't necessarily think that A relates to B so much. And then you get to the third book, which is kind of going back to the first book, where he is talking about his sort of desire to interfere in Bourne's relationship, and that in order to do this, he has to become a deceptive, manipulative person, and how he struggles with trying to become that person and ultimately fails at doing that, again, if you buy into his account. Something I actually wanted to mention, because I made a note of it while reading, is at one point in the story on page 236 in my edition, there's a mention when talking about the third story that the writer James has taken these sort of brief notes and stitched them together into a sort of semi-cohesive narrative, which he insists is entirely in James's word, or in Adam's words. But he mentions on page 236, he stops talking about clothes. Margot, Cecile, Helena, not one word about how they are dressed. And yet, when Adam describes meeting Celine in the cafe, he describes her as wearing a beret and wearing glasses. So I don't know if this is Auster making a typo. Cecile, sorry, not Celine, Cecile. I don't know if this is Auster just making a little narrative hiccup, it happens, or if this is another sort of tip-off in the story that maybe James is not quite the reliable preserver of Adam's testament that we may assume him to be. So even on that level, I guess you could say it's drawn into question. But again, like, is it just a weird editing slip-up, or is it meant to suggest something? I don't know, because the book isn't really like super dedicated to this theme to really get into that. And that I totally just got off track from where I was talking about the sub themes of Adam's quote unquote descent, but it just, when I was thinking about his meeting Cecile and their eventual non-relationship, that popped into my head. But then finally, in the last book, which Adam isn't even really referenced directly, but I think it's meant to show us more that whatever the truth of Adam is, multiple people seem to verify that Rudolph is, in fact, this terrible person and has so many different layers to him that it's, at this point, he's practically lost track of who he really is. Which, I mean, if you want to tie back to the novel's title, Invisible, it's mentioned a few times in the book, People Invisible. There's certainly Adam becoming more invisible as the story goes on, as you're not sure whether or not to believe his truth or, what the truth is. There's Bourne, who, in the sense that he has played so many different sides throughout his life that his own beliefs seem to be non-existent, he becomes kind of an invisible person. But as to whether or not that ties into a coherent theme, I don't know. And I guess one thing that I should have brought up, but I only am now thinking about in the final part of the book, is one of the recurring themes in Paul Auster's work is the sort of question of whether or not we have free will or whether or not we're at the mercy of fate. Because a recurring theme in all of his books is this sort of out-of-nowhere event that shatters the status quo of a character's life. So in this book, it's observing Rudolph murdering the boy who attempts to mug them. And ultimately, at the end, as Cecile is walking home from the airport, she observes a bunch of the islanders breaking rocks, and she notes that this is a task that is typically associated with prisoners, but that these people aren't necessarily, they're not in bars, they're doing it for work, they're doing it and getting paid for it. And I feel like the sort of meaning behind this is the suggestion that even though we are not necessarily in chains, we are all prisoners of fate to some extent, or to destiny, and how sort of Adam's completely happenstance encounter with Bourne ended up going on to alter the course of his entire life. And then Cecile's interactions with Adam went on to go on and alter the course of her entire life, and how it's sort of questioning that that old Paul Auster theme of how much control do we have over our lives? Which, again, maybe I'm missing something here, but it doesn't feel like it ties in with the name of the book, Invisible. It doesn't feel like it ties into the theme of memories. It's a theme of the book. It's a theme that Paul Auster explores in a lot of his books, so it's something he's very focused on. But the fact that your final image in the book is thematically a sort of sub-theme, but not the major theme, is really demonstrative of my overall struggle with the book, in the sense that Paul Auster, as I've said, he kind of seems like he has a bunch of ideas, starts bringing some of them together, and then gets distracted by others, and then he gets bored of the whole book, and then just ends it. And at least Invisible does, in my opinion, give a sort of satisfying send-off. Adam is dead, but there's this sort of possibility of the manuscript. Margot, unfortunately, gets completely shafted, just kind of vanishes from the story, but Celine, at least, or Cecile, I don't know why I keep wanting to call her Celine. We get to see her ending. We get to see a few other endings, the ending of Rudolph. So compared to something like Leviathan or Oracle Knight, where the ending just goes in a totally different direction, I do feel like Invisible, at least, is a semi-satisfactory ending. So that's Invisible by Paul Auster. Quick read. Ultimately, like most of Paul Auster's book, interesting but not quite life-changing. And next time I will be going with Murakami again, because, again, just visual imageries from Banana Yoshimoto's kitchen, where she's describing the Japanese inn, rather, reminds me a lot of the inn that Tsukuru Tazaki stays in, and other books have reminded me of that scene where he meets, I believe it's Midori. It's been a while since I've read the book, and so just linking things in terms of visuals. So join me next time when I cover that.